Hey, Design Basics. So let's talk about shapes. It's our next unit, and it's a great way to build off of what we've done with line and pattern. And I'm sure you've all used shapes in your art before, and you probably know quite a bit about shapes. So let's review some of the things I'm pretty sure you would know, and then let's talk about some information that might be new. First of all, let's take a look at the artists that use shape in their work. It's pretty much one of the more universal elements of art that you'll see. So we have Henri Matisse. You might have heard of him. He's a very famous French artist. He has works in like the most famous museums across the world. Very recognizable. This is one of his cutout pieces, and I think the way that he uses shape here is a little more obvious than some other works that you might see. We have clear shapes happening because this is all cut out from pieces of paper. So this is really all about shapes. And then we have an artwork that is a little more traditional, a different vibe totally. And it might be a little less obvious how this artist is using shapes, but they very much are. If you actually divide up this composition, we have a very noticeable rectangle at the very bottom that sets up a horizon line. If you build on that, on the right we have another rectangle that kind of helps our eye go upward, that vertical motion, because it's a rectangle, not a square. Then off on the left-hand side, we have a pretty dramatic triangle, and that's going to point your eye down. And then following that, we have two more triangles, all going off to the right-hand side. So that's the basic building blocks of this composition, and just another way to see how shape is really involved in all different kinds of artworks, whether it's more obvious than not. So let's talk about basics. What is a shape? It's really just when you take a bunch of lines and close them up. That's how you define it. And then there's some that I'm sure you're familiar with because I'm sure you've all talked about geometric shapes, and you'll be taking geometry at some point in high school as well. But those are really shapes that have a mathematical formula to them. So they tend to be perfect in some way. They can be round or straight, their edges can be either, but they tend to have some kind of mathematical base to their structure. Then the opposite of geometric shapes would be organic shapes, and those are really just shapes that are naturally occurring. They're considered flawed in a way because they don't have a perfect rhythm to their composition. So those are two basic types of shape. It's nice to be able to tell the difference and to use both in your artwork and to recognize them in other people's artwork. And I'm pretty sure that's probably not new information for many of you. What might be new information is the idea of static versus dynamic shapes. So static really just means not moving, no action, no change. And if you think about what we learned with our lines, we had vertical and horizontal lines, and if you remember, those created a sense of stability and peace, and they did not convey a sense of movement. So therefore, our static shapes would also have horizontal and vertical lines. Really, all shapes that have this as their backbone are not going to convey movement. They can convey other things very effectively, but not movement, not change. So the opposite of that would be dynamic. Now, if you remember, the opposite of vertical and horizontal lines were curved and diagonal lines. So the same principle here. Now we have dynamic shapes. They're in constant change. They convey activity. And if you just take every shape above and tweak it a little bit to get those angles being diagonal, then you have dynamic shapes. So those two are important differences because they can really do a lot to communicate something in an artwork. If you think of a triangle, they almost seem like they're a little bit of both, right? A triangle can have a horizontal base, it can have a vertical line, but it also definitely usually has two diagonal lines. So they can be a little bit stable, they can be a little bit dynamic, but take a triangle that is entirely diagonals, and that's clearly dynamic. That triangle looks like it's trying to run off the page. So just another way to think about how shapes are being conveyed, how they're being used, and how you can then also use them in your own work to convey something. Now, let's look at this one just one more time, because not only do shapes make up its composition, but we have a focal point. And the focal point in this arc is where the artist wants your eye to go first. It's that little spot right there in the red circle. So let's go back to our shapes, and let's think about how our shapes are helping this artist make a really good focal point. First, he has one long, again, horizontal rectangle, and then the intersection of those two rectangles is right next to his focal point. So he has a nice vertical stability rectangle on his right-hand side. So there's a sense of kind of peace and stability happening in this artwork already. And now we start adding some really dynamic triangles. We start pointing down and to the right and to the right one more time to really emphasize. He wants you to look right in that one corner. So not only just the way that the shapes are built in the composition in general, but also the way they're directing your eye where to go, whether or not it's realized. So let's just also take a look at Henri Matisse. He had the cutout artwork in the very beginning of this, and he's a French artist, again, born 1869, died 1954, 85 years old, very long life, and over that long life, he had a whole different range of artwork. If you've been to the Barnes Foundation, you've definitely seen his work. If you've been to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, they've shown a lot of his work. They had a whole show of his works on paper, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago. So if you've been into art museums, you've probably encountered Henri Matisse. And his style ranged quite a bit over his lifetime. He got a little more abstract as he got older, and sometimes he went very minimal with his works and colors and shapes. He was very known for his colors. You can see that no matter what he's doing, his colors are just so vibrant. But then once Henri Matisse got into his 60s, he started having pretty severe health problems and really couldn't control his painting the way he wanted to. So determined to keep going with his art, he started working on cutouts, which really made him think about his language in the most primitive way, just basic shapes and colors. If you lose all that brushstroke detail, because if you think about back on here, all these brushstrokes just get so detailed with variations of color and tiny little details for the eye to enjoy. So if he couldn't do that, he starts doing dynamic cutouts. And dynamic again, because look at how much movement is in his shapes. He has organic and geometric shapes happening. He became well known for these cutouts. This is a lot of how his career ended. And they're very well known in the art world. And I just thought it'd be fun to show you that a lot of artists really look to their past precedents, their ancestors, and they make work that speaks to what happened before them. So Vic Muniz is a living Brazilian artist, very well known, does a whole different kind of work than Matisse did. He's not really a painter so much. He does a lot of photography. That's one of the things he does. And here you see a photography series that's all inspired by Matisse, because Matisse's shapes and colors were so vibrant that you can recognize them without even seeing his name attached. Anyone who knows Matisse would know that this is referencing his work. So that's a little introduction to shapes, and hopefully gets you thinking about how they can be used. And just to reinforce this, we're going to watch one short video that's all about shapes and how they're used in Pixar movies.